Welcome. My name is Paul Mitchell. I'm a professor of agriculture and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and director of the Rank Agribusiness Institute. What I'm going to do in this video is record a presentation I'm giving for the Midwest Food Products Association's Processing Crops Conference, but make it available more broadly to the general public. And what the topic is an end-of-year review of the 2020 processing crops. In general, the supply chain received a lot of attention this year, which makes sense. There was a lot of disruptions, and it made the national news as we got very concerned about our food supply. We all heard about the euthanizing, the depopulating of livestock as the processing plants couldn't take the livestock. They just didn't have room on the kill floors to deal with all the livestock we needed to turn into our meat products that we love and love to eat. Also had dairy, milk, same boat. Same problem, milk being dumped. We saw runs on processing vegetables and other foods. Certain foods were just gone from grocery store shelves, and of course the big toilet paper craze. People buying lots of toilet paper. What I want to do this year in this talk, though, is focusing in on the crops that were planted, the production side, not the post-production so much as the actual crop production. So what we saw is 2019 was a very bad year for prevented plant. These are data back from 2008 all the way up to 2020. And what you see is, here's that bad year in 2019, 19.6 million acres of prevented plant. Well, this year, 2020, was also a bad year for prevented plant. We had 9 million acres. The only other year the worst was back in 2011 with 9.6 million. So surprisingly, after that really bad year, 2020 also had a pretty significant amount of prevented plant acres. You look at this map provided by the John Newton at the Farm Bureau, and you see very clearly there's a big pocket over there in that Red River Valley in the Dakotas, Minnesota border down into South Dakota, and then along the river valleys, but particularly the lower Mississippi River Valley, but also the Missouri River, and there's other pockets out there. Focusing in on processing crops, we also saw there are some reasonable amounts here in Wisconsin, surprisingly. With pockets, even Dane County shows up in red, and other areas of the country. So the point I'm making there is there were definitely pockets this year where the spring weather was not cooperating for getting crops planted. However, here in looking at Wisconsin, we had a great year. Planting progress, these are USDA data for Wisconsin in 2020. The solid line is the planting curve for the 2020. The dashed line is the planting curve, the 5-year average. And then 2019 is the dotted line there, which was shows how much later everything was in dates for corn and soybeans. And in general, we were 1 to 1.5 weeks ahead of our 5-year average and 3 weeks ahead of 2019 for corn and soybeans. So in Wisconsin, for a lot of farmers who got a crop planted, it went really well. Now, it's hard to get acreage reports at this time of year. In November, there's not a lot of information, particularly on processing vegetables, on what was actually planted everywhere. But these are data available for the insurance data are available. They do their acreage reports. And so these aren't all planted acres. These are insured acres of these crops. What you can see, it fits our general idea of what we expect to happen. Sweet corn, Minnesota has a lot of insured acres. Washington, Wisconsin, you look at snap beans, Wisconsin is a major producer along with New York. And then you go to green peas, and again, Minnesota, Washington, and Wisconsin dominate those 3 crops on insured acres. Most of this will be the same on planted acres. The numbers will be changed. There'll be more planted acres than insured acres. But in general, these are the large states for processing crops. What I want to emphasize here, though, is the changes in these acres. And I've also added potatoes now because so many of these farms rotate potatoes and processing vegetables. And so what you'll see here is Minnesota lost 4,000 acres of sweet corn on insured acres, and it moved to Wisconsin, it looks like. Same thing happened in Oregon. We lost about 2,000 acres, and it popped up most of it in Washington. Snap beans, we saw a big jump in Wisconsin of 4,000 acres. Same thing with green peas, another 4,000, 4,500 acres. Also in Minnesota picked up more green peas, and whereas Washington cut back some. The big change, though, is on potatoes over here. And you really see Wisconsin and Minnesota have a few thousand fewer insured acres. We're not sure about planted acres yet. But we saw a big drop in Washington, had a lot fewer insured acres for potatoes, and did Idaho, especially in Washington, 19,000. Idaho is the leading potato state, and 9,000 is a drop. But Washington is second, and the acres there it'll show up as most likely a decrease in planted acres. And we saw this with the disruptions in the food system A lot of people weren't using potatoes at restaurants anymore and food institutions, like hospitals or schools. And so the farmers there stopped growing potatoes for making French fries, like McDonald's and et cetera, and moved to other potatoes. And so we saw, or other crops. And so we saw a drop in insured acres for sure in potatoes out there as they moved into other crops. But you can see there wasn't a large shift on other processing crops, so they must have gone to some other crops, probably wheat would be my first guess. Um, Now we're going to switch to the weather over the growing season. So we got everything planted. We had a great planting year for most farmers, but there was, again, prevented plant. Now we're looking at the weather, and these are from Joe Lauer in the UW Agronomy Department. They are for Arlington, just north of Madison here, and Marshfield up in north central Wisconsin. The green line is the average of, and this is growing degree days, so accumulated temperatures, and the black line is the actual trend or the actual data for this year, 2020. What you'll see is Wisconsin, it started out cool. We had fewer than average degree days, and it was below average. Then sometime in late June, it started to really increase slowly in Arlington, where it actually got back above average and actually had slightly more, a little bit warmer. So that means we had a fairly typical year. The summer went along well. We got some average temperatures. Never quite got there in Marshfield. It started out cool, and then it got sort of normal temperatures, but because of the early coolness, the growing degree days never quite caught up from April 1st. And then it really cooled off at the end there where it declined. And so Marshfield is a little cooler than average, but in the middle of the season, it was a fairly average year, but slower because of the accumulated temperatures because of the cool start to the year. Precipitation is very similar. We had average precipitation here at Arlington. It'd be below average, a little dry rain. And so you see it stayed fairly typical. Marshfield, the same thing, maybe a little drier at the end of the year. You're looking more broadly nationally now. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor. And what this shows, I just took the middle of June, July, August, September, sort of the growing season months. And the yellow it gets drier than normal. The browns and reds, it's a drought. And you can see the western areas had strong droughts, and that's the wildfires are what happened. But it's been dry out west. Sorry about that. And so what we're going to look here is what I really want to see is in Wisconsin, almost nothing. There's a few dry patches appeared late September up in the Northeast, over in the western Wisconsin in August. But in general, even Minnesota had fairly good growing conditions in terms of precipitation throughout the whole season. The only one that really shows up is Iowa. In western Iowa, there's a drought area that got pretty severe at the red there. So we saw it got kind of dry in that western corn belt of Iowa and Nebraska. The other big news, though, in derecho hit in Iowa on August 10th and 11th. And I'd never seen anything like this. You can just see the winds. These are, the blue is 60 to 70 mile an hour winds. The light green is 70 to 80. The dark green is 80 to 100. The orange is 100 to 120. And that red is more than 120 mile an hour winds. That's category 3 hurricanes. The hurricane is more consistent, but these are large gusts of wind that were really high. The bottom picture on the right is a radio tower that was rated for 130 miles per hour. It was knocked over, blown over by the wind up near Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So you can see this is south of Des Moines, and this area here is across sort of central Wisconsin or central Iowa, all the way across to north of Cedar Rapids there. Really high winds. And you can see the photos here, flattened corn. The numbers are 550,000 acres of corn and soybean just flattened, damage to structures, just blowing these grain bins over and destroying the corn. The paper, the Des Moines Register, has it at $7.5 billion in late October is what their estimate of the losses, and continuing to increase. It was a really bad. You can see it hit northern Illinois. We do have some processing vegetables out here, but in general, we saw a bad windstorm in southern Wisconsin, but nothing like what they saw in Iowa. So now switching to the USDA collects crop conditions all summer long. You see from mid-May all the way to the end of the season, the red is Wisconsin, the blue is Minnesota, and this is the percent of corn acres in excellent condition. Wisconsin led the nation all summer long, had the best corn acres and the largest percentage of corn acres in excellent condition, around a third, 30 to 35% for big chunks of the year. Minnesota right behind it. Soybeans, the same story. Wisconsin way above everyone else. Minnesota at the top of the pile right behind there of really good acres. The other thing we'll emphasize is Iowa and Illinois. Iowa's in black and Illinois is in sort of this orangey color. They're the leading corn and soybean states. You can see Iowa started to get dry, and then the derecho it just took it down to 5% of the acres in good, excellent condition. Illinois sort of stayed in the middle of the pack all year long. Same thing in the soybeans, dry weather, and then it hit the derecho. Once you go to good and excellent, Wisconsin and Minnesota are still high. They're at the top of the pile, and they stayed there all summer long. You see some states were there for a while and disappeared, like Iowa fell off there on both crops, and some come and go and are there for periods of time. But consistently this year, Wisconsin and Minnesota had a large number of acres in good to excellent condition in soybeans and corn all summer long. Looking at the other two crops that are available in these measures is potato and oats. We'll talk about potato. What you see is Wisconsin and Minnesota both had some pretty good potato years ahead of the pile of all the other potato states. Idaho is the only one above it in the black line there. So we had a good potato year, it looks like. And then oats now shows that there might, everything might not be as perfect as all these other crops. Oats I'm using as a proxy. First off, it's USDA data are available for oats crop conditions. And then it's a proxy for some of these processing vegetables. It goes in a little earlier and has a growing season in the middle there. And then it's harvested fairly early relative to crops like corn and soybeans. What you see here is Wisconsin is in the middle of the pile. Minnesota sort of on the bottom pile of the bottom of the pile more. So it might not have been as good for some crops that are similar in terms of the growing season that they use as oats, early season and mid-season crops. Now we're looking at how Minnesota and Wisconsin did relative to their long run averages or their 5-year averages and then the last year. What you see, this is in good to excellent condition. Wisconsin's corn was above average, its 5-year average all summer long, way above what it was in 2019. Same story for Minnesota, above its long run average all summer long, a little bit drier or something at the end of the year there. But in general, both states had good corn acres. Same thing for soybeans, above average all summer long. Going potatoes, Wisconsin had a much better potato year than average. Their dashed line is the average, and Wisconsin is the 90 to 95% of the potato crop is in good to excellent condition. Minnesota traditionally is in that 90 to 95%, and that's where it was all summer long. So it's hard to get better when you're already in that 90 to 95%. So Wisconsin had a great potato year. Minnesota had another great potato year, like it always seems to have. Now you see with oats, Wisconsin had a pretty typical year in oats, right on the average. Minnesota, you can see, actually had below average, and it was just like 2019 for most of the season for oats. So the crops that are like oats in Minnesota might not have done quite so well. So to get some estimate or idea of what this not quite done so well, what these are crop insurance loss ratios for these vegetable crops. We've got sweet corn, snap beans, green peas, and potatoes. And we get the blue is 2019, the orange is 2020. What this loss ratio is the at the aggregate level, when a farmer pays into crop insurance, they pay part of the premium, and the U.S. government pays part of the premium. That's the cost share they provide, the subsidy, the premium subsidy. And then when they take that and take the indemnities the farmers receive and divide it by that premium paid in, that's the loss ratio. So this, for example, we'll look at this big blue number here. Blue bar for Wisconsin in 2019. For sweet corn, on average, farmers paid in $1 and got back $7 in indemnities. That's what that 7 means for this in 2019 in sweet corn. That's a bad year for farmers. That means they had a lot of losses. They got back a lot of money, but they're still not. They have a coverage level, and so they have a deductible they paid. So they're not back to whole. 2019 was a bad year for sweet corn in Wisconsin. Now we're looking at 2020 now. That's what these loss ratios are. Minnesota had a relatively bad year, it looks like, in sweet corn, a loss ratio of almost 4. These are as of November 16th. There are still losses coming in, so these can still only go upwards. But Wisconsin had a good year. The farmer loss ratio was well below 1, so the money paid in broke even roughly from the farmer's perspective. And then you add on the subsidy, generally about 3 is where the program starts losing money, in the sense that that year was a bad year for the program. They paid in $3 and got back $3. Would be a pretty typical loss ratio. So what you see here is Minnesota had some evidence of a bad sweet corn year. So think back to those oat production that we saw. We see the data of not kind of falling below average on good to excellent conditions for oats. And green peas is the other crop that seems to have struggled in 2020. Wisconsin had a loss ratio approaching 4, even back in last year as well, similar, actually worse than last year. And Minnesota had some, the loss ratio for the farmer's perspective is a little over 2, almost like last year. And so green peas had relatively higher loss ratios for these crops in 2020. The only other one that really sticks out is Oregon potatoes. Seems to have had a really bad year for potatoes in Oregon. So if I had to summarize what looks like the crop insurance data are telling us is Minnesota had not a great year in sweet corn, and a lot of states struggled, particularly Wisconsin, in green peas. So how was the 2020 crop year for processing vegetables? It was a good year for Wisconsin and Minnesota for corn and soybeans and potatoes. No major disruptions for processing vegetables. The Minnesota and Wisconsin led the nation corn and soybeans crop conditions all year long, and we generally had we had a good processing crop. There was some evidence of sweet corn struggling in Minnesota and green peas in many states, but it wasn't a disaster by any means. The crop insurance data also suggests a shift in acreage. More sweet corn in Wisconsin, more snap beans and more pea acres, less potatoes. Minnesota saw less sweet corn and more in potatoes and more peas, but the big changes were in potatoes out west in acres. So overall, I think the processing vegetables in 2020 got lucky. You saw what happened in the meat packing industry. You saw what happened in dairy processing. Processing vegetables, we were lucky. We had time to get our facilities ready for the COVID pandemic, to keep our workers healthy and get systems worked out so we didn't have processing disruptions. And then luckily, we didn't have problems with the crops like 2019 or other years. Sometimes the crops can be a problem. If we had COVID disruptions and crop disruptions, it could have been a major problem for processing vegetables. But it looks like in general, we had a good crop production year and the processing went well because we had time to prepare for the COVID pandemic.